Okay, so I'm gonna hopefully give kind of a big picture overview of the entire interior population from what we've found so far. So it's gonna be a little different, but yeah, bear with me. So there's only three names up here, but this was a really big collaborative effort. Tons of people, many of whom are in this room right now. So thank you, and I'll get started. So the story kind of starts as you're all familiar with market hunting and the widespread decimation of trumpeter swans across the landscape. This here is a punt gun, which can basically blast an entire flock at one go, and which led to trumpeter swans being extirpated from all but Red Rock Lakes. And then once they're found in Alaska, as you all know, they're taken back for reintroductions through much hard work from all the states in the greater Midwest. So sorry to show you this map one more time, but in case anyone's not familiar, the reintroductions for the IP Swan came from two locations. So right here where we are in the tri-state area, and then also up at Minto Flats in Alaska. So just one thing to keep in mind is that these two source populations have very different migratory habits. So the Red Rock Lake birds were not migratory and the Alaska birds were. And things overall went really well. There's lots of trumpeter swans across the Midwest. Things are good. So what comes next? So although there are many swans across the landscape, there's a surprising amount that we don't know that well. And I'm going to be talking about a lot of movement-based questions for the talk here today. So specifically looking at how many swans are migrating or not, how far are they going and for how long, when are they leaving and when are they coming back, and how do all these things get worked out with latitude and breeding class. So we tried to spread our sample size across as much of the breeding range of the IP as we could. We partnered with 5 other states and 1 Canadian province, and all had kind of similar methods. And we caught swans during their complete molt through a whole variety of different methods. I preferred flat bottom john boats with a long tail mud motor. Other people used airboats. Some people used kayaks and canoes. But everyone fit swans with these swan collars that look pretty familiar at this point: Ornatella, GPS, GSM. So they take locations every 15 minutes, and once a day they'll upload through a cell phone network or attempt to upload. So the colors here don't matter. This is just trying to give a representation of where we were catching swans. So about 114 collars. This is including some redeployments. So there's about 14 of those. And so we did pretty well about trying to get wide swath. Some of these were a little more clumped than others, but I think overall people did well. And then it kind of shows the coverage of data we've gotten uploaded. So every row is a state or province, and then each line is a collar giving information. So you can see these gray bars are where we had deployment phases. So the first summer, we were lucky to have help from Michigan. They had a mute swan survey that had a bunch of collars, didn't work. They got replacement collars, but their study was over. So we swooped in and said, why don't you put these on trumpeters? And they were gracious enough to do so. And then I only ordered 7 collars from Ornatella. I wanted to make sure that they worked well and give myself a little time to figure out how to best catch trumpeter swans. And that turned out to be a good decision in hindsight because 6 of the 7 collars failed, either the next winter or spring. So we talked to the manufacturers at Ornatella, had them replace the foam housing with some high density epoxy, and then those all did much better when we were ordering like that number to deploy the next summer in 2020. And so this summer after that was either states finishing their initial deployments or I redeployed a bunch of collars in Minnesota that we were able to get from mortality. And then there was also a brief period where Gary Ivey went down to Arkansas and worked with some Arkansas Fish and Game folks and put out 4 collars down there. So then now we've got 5 million GPS points from all these swans from all these years. So I needed to find a kind of efficient method to go through all this data and answer these questions. So what I ended up using as kind of a input information is displacement. So this figure shows one swan over 2 years. This is time along the x-axis, and this is how far it is from the origin point. So that's either a breeding territory or for the non-breeders, just where they were captured. And you can see it kind of goes through the typical pattern of a normal long distance migration. Here's winter, and it comes back in the summer. So this was sort of what I would use for the eventual analysis. So we use something called piecewise regression. The details don't matter. I had a slide full of formulas and I took it away to save people the aggravation. But basically we're using it to cluster similar chunks of time together. So it finds breakpoints in time that delineate stationary segments based on these average displacement values. And I'll show a figure to make that a little more clear, but basically this will give us information on the temporal information from breakpoints, and then also the spatial information because we'll have those values of displacement. So here's that same time series, and then here it is fit with piecewise regression. So you can see you've got a nice segment for when it's on the breeding range. There's a couple it picks up for fall staging. Here's wintering, and then you get another segment here when it comes back in the spring. So this can give me all the information I need for these questions, and I can run this in an automated, objective way. So it can tell when they're leaving in the fall, how many staging areas they're using, when they arrive and leave at those, where they are, how long they're staying, and then the overall. We're basically considering wintering as another staging area because there's a lot wrapped up in what people consider wintering, and swans don't always follow the rules super nicely. Yeah, so before I go to that, so big picture, this worked well for the majority of our data set. About half of the swans had long distance migration. The other half were either a mixture of residents or there was sort of the same migration path, but it was much shorter distance. Some were dispersal and some fit no categories whatsoever. So I don't want to put too much emphasis on those percentages because it's very kind of dependent on what birds we were catching and where. So it doesn't necessarily reflect the whole interior population. But the relationships they'll show hopefully are a better way to kind of convey them. So how far are they moving from the summer territories during the non-breeding period? Swans that were breeding at higher latitudes traveled further. Not surprisingly, this is what we would expect. Although there is a lot of variation, which I'll get into. So if you kind of break this up in terms of a threshold for what you're calling long distance migration, and then I'm dividing the latitudes as well, you can see that there weren't any swans from down south that moved big distances. There weren't any swans from way up north that didn't move big distances. And therefore, we think based on these latitudinal zones that the swans down south are obligate residents. The majority of our study area were facultative, where some are migrating and some are overwintering. And then all the ones way up north into Canada, these are obligate migrants. What was kind of interesting and a little perplexing is that there were a lot of swans at relatively high latitudes that weren't making big long distance migrations. So why are these not moving as far as the others are? So we looked into that a little bit. This is a snapshot from winter, the first year after we had a whole bunch of colors on birds. And the colors are showing you where swans are, but also what kind of water they're on. So all the purple dots are artificial open water. So like Laura was talking about quarries, a lot of people have bubblers on their lakes that the fish don't die in the winter. So there's a bunch of sort of human influenced areas to prevent water from freezing. There's also a lot of use of rivers. The same vein, you know, if swans have open water and food, they're doing okay. And then all the yellow dots in the bottom, these are where it was just not cold enough to be frozen at that point in time. So it was interesting and a little bit of a surprise just coming into this naively, how swans were able to kind of figure out their landscape to winter high up north. Looking at fall migration, we don't see such a clean relationship like before. But one thing that kind of struck out to me was that there's sort of these big pulses of migration when they're leaving. So these are likely due to big changes in weather. And we're going to add that data going forward to look at that a little bit more closely. Yeah, and looking at spring arrival, there was agreement between the 2 years and kind of the average time, but then the first year is really tight. You know, all these swans are basically getting back in the same couple of weeks, whereas the next year there's huge variability. And so I think this is interesting because if you think about, well, this spring arrival might be sort of an innate anticipatory response where these swans are moving when they're far away from the breeding grounds and they don't know what's going on there. So is this kind of an internal process? And it shows that there is a lot of variability. It's not always the same year to year. So that was interesting to think about. Looking at how long migration takes and looking at by breeding class. So here breeders are considered if they had cygnets at the time of capture. Paired are swans but no cygnets. So these could be failed breeders or they could be subadults. And then non-breeders were swans that were in big groups. So breeders didn't take as long for migration as you'd expect. They need to kind of stick with their young until they can leave in the fall, and they need to get there early in the spring to defend their territory. Looking at fall and spring specifically, breeders left later in the fall than non-breeders. Like the medians are similar, but there's a lot of overlap, and yeah. And then in the spring, breeders got back substantially earlier than non-breeders, and the paired swans kind of split the difference between the two. So coming back to this plot a little bit, it seemed like there's possibly something going on where there could be sort of two groups with different migration strategies. So there's a lot of swans that, as you expect, kind of migrate as migrants do. But for these, it seems that it might be swans maybe try and stick to where they are, say, unless winter gets really hairy and they get pushed off. And so there could be a whole bunch of different reasons. This is purely speculative and just kind of what I'm basing the next steps off of. But remember the difference in migratory history between these two source populations, and add that on top of you've wiped out this landscape and now you're putting new swans on it. And so how are they going to develop these migratory patterns? So we've got genetic data from all the swans we captured. We got a bunch from the High Plains block, and then almost 100 from the RMP and PCP swans as well. And so we're going to be able to group all these swans, see where they kind of fall out, and then we'll be able to say, the swans we're catching now, how much Alaskan stock do they have versus tri-state, and see if that kind of correlates with the way that they're moving. So to kind of sum things up, overall, the IP is a partially migratory population. Some are resident, some are migrant each year. Latitude strongly correlated with how far they're going. And it seemed that breeding class was pretty important for the timing of those movements. Also, swans were really adept at being able to overwinter further north by using rivers and artificial open water. Okay, so what does this mean? What's the point? So if you think about implications, you know, I've basically described one little snapshot in time of what's going on. But for the bigger importance, it's going to depend a little bit more on why swans are moving when they do. And so these are three possible things that are important of drivers of migration. Could be how they're adapting to their environment and their landscape, and that could have a bunch of weather and climate influences. And so with that, as climate changes, as we know it will swans adapt, or will they have the ability to in that time? So this is a map showing what Minneapolis climate is going to look like in 60 years. And so that's sort of the projections when we're on the same emissions level as we're at now. So will the whole range push up, or will swans be able to kind of adapt in other ways? It's kind of an open question. Depending on how important genetic influences are of this innate movement, it'll be important to know what is the population structure of swans now. Is that High Plains flock in Nebraska and South Dakota completely isolated? Will it eventually get gene flow as swans increase on the landscape. And so we're going to quantify the gene flow that we see right now as well. And then also, everyone knows swans as long-lived birds. The social aspects are super important too. So as young birds, go with their parents that first year and imprint on these migratory patterns, is that going to make it a lot harder for them to shift things if all this is moving so fast? So there's work that kind of highlights that if the more important that socially passed down information is, the longer it can take to be kind of adaptive plastic in these migratory patterns. Unfortunately, that's a really hard thing to study. So see how that goes. But thank you so much to all these different agencies and funders and people catching the swans and people buying collars and people spreading the word. So really grateful of all the help that we've gotten and be happy to take any questions at this time.